A nurse who can't even document a basic admission shouldn't be anywhere near critical patients. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 47 minutes before everything changed. Seattle General's night shift hums with fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell, the kind that coats your throat after 8 hours. Brooke Sullivan moves through the pediatric ICU corridor at 11:56 p.m., her badge clipped to scrubs that reveal nothing, not the scars along her collarbone, not the tremor in her left wrist that only surfaces when she's alone, not the name that no longer exists in any Pentagon database. Her shoes are quiet on the tile. Deliberate. She has been practicing quiet for 3 years. Room for 08 sits at the end of the hall. Inside, 7-year-old Emma Hayes sleeps beneath a thermal blanket, her small chest rising with the mechanical precision of monitored breathing. The girl has been here for 12 days now. 12 days and 12 different doctors rotating through her case, each one examining her declining stats with fresh eyes and leaving with frustrated questions. Emma's father, Marine General Richard Hayes, sits in a chair beside the bed, the kind of man whose shoulders don't fit in hospital furniture, whose presence makes the air pressure change. He looks like he's used to giving orders to thousands. Right now he looks like he's failed to save one 7-year-old. Brooke checks the cardiac monitor first. 94 beats per minute. Steady. She notes the oxygen saturation, 87%, and the blood pressure reading displayed on the screen. Then she pulls Emma's chart from the wall-mounted holder, her eye scanning the notes from the afternoon shift with the precision of someone who has read 10,000 medical charts and missed nothing important in any of them. The first physician's entry, pediatric decline of unclear etiology. Further workup pending. Viral panel negative. The second, rule out primary cardiac involvement. Stress echo ordered. The third, patient remains febrile but responsive. Consider infectious process. Brooke reads each notation like she's translating a language the doctors are speaking incorrectly. Emma's heart sounds are muffled on auscultation. Her jugular veins are distended, not dramatically, not enough to trigger alarm bells, but they're there. The decline is too subtle for a viral illness. Too organized. The fever keeps returning at 38.4 degrees Celsius, not the spiking pattern of infection. The girl's abdomen is slightly distended. Her breathing, while still adequate, carries the faintest undertone of effort that oxygen alone doesn't explain. She's drowning from the inside. Brooke charts her own assessment in measured language, documenting what she observes without diagnosis, without overstepping, without giving Dr. Whitfield ammunition. Decreased heart sound clarity. Elevated JVD. Persistent low-grade fever. Subjective respiratory effort increase since 2200 hours. The words are careful. The words are defensible. The words are also screaming if you know how to listen. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Marcus Whitfield arrives for evening rounds at 12:15 a.m., and the ICU shifts. His shoes click against the tile floor like a metronome of privilege, custom Italian leather that costs more than Brooke's monthly rent. He moves through the pediatric unit with the confidence of a man who has never been questioned by a nurse, has never been challenged by a resident, has never opened his own chart and seen the billing patterns that would make the hospital's auditors weep. Behind him trails for residents and 2 medical students, the standard flock that gathers around senior physicians like remoras on a shark. Brooke stands at the medication cart, preparing Emma's scheduled doses. She doesn't turn when he enters. She knows his voice before he speaks, the particular timbre of someone who learned charm the way soldiers learn weapon systems, as a tool to be deployed strategically. "Team," he says, and the fluorescent light seems to dim slightly, "let's discuss documentation standards in pediatric critical care." Brooke's jaw tightens imperceptibly. She continues drawing up the medication with the steady precision of someone who has performed this action 3,847 times without error. Dr. Whitfield holds up her chart. Emma's chart. He walks it through the group like he's displaying a piece of evidence in a courtroom. Notice the vagueness. The lack of specificity. When we document in this manner, we are not providing actionable intelligence to the treating team. We're creating liability. He looks directly at the residents. We're creating the appearance of incompetence. The 12 doctors present don't move. They've learned that moving when Whitfield is speaking constitutes disagreement, and disagreement is dangerous in a hierarchy where he controls admission privileges and fellowship recommendations and the subtle power of whether your name gets mentioned in the departmental newsletter. Brooke sets the medication down and turns to face him. Her eyes are flat. Her hands are steady. Those notes document objective findings, Doctor. The patient's condition has changed since. I'm not finished, Whitfield says, and his voice drops into the register that makes residents check their phone batteries. Dangerously inadequate documentation. That's what I'm seeing here. He looks at her the way you might look at equipment that's failed inspection, a brief assessment followed by disinterest. Perhaps the night shift would benefit from a refresher course in medical charting standards. I could recommend someone. He doesn't wait for her response. He moves to room 408 with his flock, and the door closes behind him, and Brooke is alone at the medication cart with the knowledge that she has just been publicly evaluated and found wanting by someone who has never spent a night in a pediatric ICU and doesn't intend to start. The medication finishes drawing. She administers it. Her hands don't shake. But that wasn't the worst part either. General Richard Hayes emerges from room 408 as the team is finishing rounds. He's a man shaped by decades of command, broad shoulders, sharp eyes that miss nothing, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst and knowing you'll survive whatever's next. He approaches the nurse station where Brooke is charting Emma's vitals post-examination. Her condition is declining, he says. It's not a question. It's a report. Yes, sir, Brooke says. She doesn't look up from her notes, but her voice carries the particular respect reserved for commanding officers, the kind that slips out when you've spent more years in uniform than out of it. Over the past 12 hours, her oxygen saturation has dropped from 89 to 87. Her heart sounds have become progressively quieter on auscultation. The physicians are running additional studies. He studies her for 4 seconds. She can feel the weight of that attention, a man used to assessing people quickly and accurately, the way soldiers develop a survival skill for recognizing who is actually competent and who just wears the uniform well. What would you be looking for? He asks. She glances up. Her eyes are steady. The decline pattern suggests accumulation rather than acute infection. If I was investigating, I'd be looking at cardiac or pericardial involvement. Something building slowly over days. He nods once. Thank you, nurse. He returns to room 408, and Brooke returns to charting, and the night shift continues with a quiet rhythm of monitors and machines and the soft padding of feet on tile that goes on for hours and hours. The break room at 2:33 a.m. is empty except for Brooke and the vending machine that has never once given her the Diet Coke she selected. She deposits $2 and presses C7. The machine clicks and whirs and produces a Sprite instead. She's about to walk away when Whitfield appears in the doorway, no longer surrounded by residents, no longer performing for an audience. The vending machine work for you, Sullivan? He asks. His voice is light. Conversational. The tone a predator uses when the prey doesn't realize it's been targeted. It works fine, Brooke says. She doesn't turn around. Because I watched you try twice. You seem to struggle with basic tasks. He steps closer. His presence fills the small room like smoke. The nurses I employ should be able to navigate simple machinery. Should be able to follow basic documentation protocols. Should probably not exceed their scope of practice by suggesting diagnoses they're not qualified to make. Brooke turns to face him. Her jaw is tight. Her hands are at her sides. Everything in her body language screams military bearing, the spine straight, shoulders back, the kind of posture that comes from marching into rooms while carrying weapons that could level buildings. But her voice, when she speaks, is measured and quiet. I documented findings. I didn't diagnose. You made suggestions to a parent that circumvented the attending physician. Whitfield smiles. It's not a kind expression. That's precisely the kind of overreach that gets people terminated. That gets security involved. I wouldn't want to see that happen to you, but my hands would be tied if this pattern continues. She doesn't respond. The silence stretches for 3 seconds, then 5, then 7. In that silence, she's calculating. The number of staff in the break room is 0, the surveillance cameras, 3, position to monitor but not the corner where they're standing, the distance to the exit, 4 feet, the probability that he'll escalate beyond threats, high, but only if provoked. She's not going to provoke him. I understand, she says quietly. It won't happen again. Whitfield nods, satisfied, and leaves. Behind him, the break room hums with fluorescent lights and the distant mechanical whir of a refrigerator. Brooke stands motionless for 30 seconds. Then she retrieves her sprite from the machine and walks back to her shift, her face betraying nothing, her breathing level, her hands as steady as they always are. The night continues. Emma's monitors display numbers that should be reassuring but aren't. Brooke charts each change with the precision of a soldier recording coordinates. In room 408, General Hayes sits beside his daughter's bed, trusting 12 physicians to find what's wrong. None of them will find it. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Not for another 12 days, until a nurse who learned to read critical patients in a Baghdad field hospital under mortar fire decides that protocols and scope and self-preservation don't matter anymore when a child is suffocating from the inside. But that moment hasn't arrived yet. Right now, there's only the shift continuing, the monitors humming, and Brooke Sullivan moving through the darkness with a secret that will eventually detonate everything, hers and Whitfield's both. The next 10 days became a masterclass in misdiagnosis. 12 different physicians cycled through Emma Hayes's room, pediatric cardiologists, intensivists, the hospital's chief of infectious disease, visiting specialists from Baylor, and each one examined the 7-year-old with the confidence of someone certain they already knew the answer. A viral myocarditis, most concluded. Self-limiting. Supportive care. The child simply needed time to recover, rest, fluids, monitoring. The monitors hummed their mechanical reassurance while Emma's body told a different story. Brooke documented everything in writing. Not because protocol demanded it. Because her hands had learned in Baghdad that what you see is less important than what you measure, and what you measure is less important than what you write down. She noted the jugular venous distension that worsened with each shift, the veins in Emma's neck bulging slightly more each night, visible evidence of pressure building somewhere the specialists weren't looking. She charted the muffled heart sounds, the kind of distance in the thoracic cavity that meant something was growing there, filling the space where only heartbeats should live. She recorded the child's subtle pallor deepening, a shade shift too gradual for casual observation but undeniable when you tracked it across 12 shifts. She wrote it all down in clear, measured language that Dr. Whitfield would later hold up to a room full of residents as an example of nursing school paranoia masquerading as clinical judgment. On the 3rd day, Whitfield reassigned her? Not with words, that would have required acknowledging her concern directly. Instead, her name simply disappeared from Emma's assignment sheet. A clerical decision, the charge nurse explained with a sympathetic glance. Dr. Whitfield felt it was important for the patient to have continuity with the day shift team, to maintain the cardiologist primary approach. Brooke was needed on the other side of the unit. 3 more patients required her attention. Important patients. Patients whose care wasn't being compromised by an overzealous RN trying to practice medicine without a license. The strategic move was elegant. Whitfield had restricted her access without confrontation, without paperwork, without giving her anything to formally protest. She could observe Emma only during report times, only during routine medication passes, only when the day shift nurses required assistance with tasks they hadn't yet delegated. She couldn't spend 40 minutes in the room analyzing breath sounds. She couldn't sit at the bedside during night shifts and watch the way Emma's chest barely moved with each breath, the way her lips had taken on the faintest blue tint at the edges. She couldn't document the things she knew, deep in the muscle memory of 18 years, spelled danger. But she could still see her. That much Whitfield couldn't prevent. Each shift, Brooke watched Emma deteriorate. The pallor deepened from pale pink to the color of a candle, a bloodless white that made the child's dark eyes seem too large for her face. Her breathing pattern changed, becoming shallow, more laboured, as if drawing air had become work, as if something inside the small ribcage was taking up space it shouldn't. Her vital signs drifted in the direction every experienced ICU nurse recognizes, the slow drift toward decompensation, the body's quiet signal that something fundamental had stopped working correctly. Emma's heart rate climbed. Her blood pressure, previously stable, began a slow downward march. Her urine output decreased. The clinical picture was textbook for one specific condition, and that condition was being missed by every attending physician in the hospital because they were all looking in the wrong direction, seeing what they expected to see instead of what was actually happening. The child's father, Marine General Richard Hayes, maintained a vigil that never wavered. He sat in a chair that faced the bed, still in a combat uniform despite being stateside, his posture rigid with the discipline of 40 years of service. Brooke recognized him the moment she walked into the room on shift 4. General Hayes, the officer whose photo appeared in the Navy Times article about Marine Expeditionary Force leadership. The officer now commanding her son's unit in Helmand Province. The officer who had no idea that the nurse moving through his daughter's room had once conducted combat operations under rules of engagement that made civilian medical practice look like kindergarten first aid. She kept her face neutral, her movements routine, her acknowledgement of him nothing more than the respectful nod she gave to all families. He was watching his daughter die in increments, and she was the only person in the hospital documenting that it was happening. On the night of day 9, Brooke sat in the break room with her coffee, which she'd successfully retrieved from the vending machine without Dr. Whitfield's commentary, though the memory of his voice lingered like an infection. 2 physicians sat across the table reviewing scans. A resident, fresh from his rotation in pediatric cardiology, turned to his attending and asked whether they'd ordered the pericardial window yet, whether they were considering the possibility that the echo findings suggested, but the attending cut him off. "We've already ruled that out. The presentation doesn't fit." The resident fell silent. That was how it happened. That was how children died in hospital beds with competent physicians standing over them, because once a path had been chosen, changing course required admitting the initial assessment was incomplete. And physicians, Brooke had learned across 1,000 shifts, rarely admitted they'd missed something. On the night of day 12, everything became unavoidable. Brooke entered room for 08 at 0200 hours. The hospital had that quality only night shifts possess, a strange half-alive state where equipment sounds carried farther, where the absence of daytime activity made every small noise seem amplified. General Hayes was asleep in the chair, his head tilted back at an angle that would leave his neck stiff, his uniform still pressed and immaculate despite days of sleeping vertical. Emma lay with her eyes open, and that was the first wrong thing. 7-year-olds in the ICU sleep. They sedated them, monitored them, let them rest. Emma's eyes were open and fixed, tracking nothing, seeing past the room into some interior geography of discomfort. Brooke placed her hand on the child's small chest. The skin was cool. Not cold, cool. The kind of cool that speaks of peripheral vasoconstriction, of a body recognizing that oxygen was becoming scarce and choosing to protect its core. She reached for the stethoscope and placed the diaphragm against Emma's chest, over the area where the heart should have announced itself with clear, ringing tones. Instead, she heard what 12 cardiologists had failed to document: silence. Not the silence of a flat line. The silence of a heartbeat being muffled, dampened, compressed by something filling the space it needed to occupy. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid in the pericardial sac. A surgical emergency masquerading as a stable patient. She straightened up and looked at Emma's neck. The jugular veins were distended so visibly now that the skin itself seemed stretched with pressure. Her respiratory rate had climbed to 32 breaths per minute. Her oxygen saturation, despite the supplemental oxygen flowing through her nasal cannula, read 91% and dropping. Her blood pressure, the most recent reading on the monitor, displayed 78/45. General Hayes woke when Brooke turned toward the monitor, and he saw her face before she could arrange it, saw the professional mask slip for one instant and reveal what she'd been documenting alone for 9 days. He stood up from the chair. "What's wrong with my daughter?" Brooke's voice when she spoke was level, pitched to carry authority without raising volume. "Your daughter needs an intervention now. Page Dr. Whitfield stat, code team notification. This is a presumed cardiac emergency. She moved to the computer and pulled up Emma's last echocardiogram, the study Whitfield had ordered and never reviewed. There it was, captured in the ultrasound imaging, the pericardial effusion, fluid accumulating around the heart in a crescent shadow, building pressure with each passing hour. 200 milliliters now, maybe more. At her current rate of accumulation, the fluid would restrict the heart's ability to fill completely within the hour. When that happened, Emma's blood pressure would collapse. Her organs would begin to fail. Her heart would stop beating effectively, and no amount of chest compressions could fix what fluid surrounding the ventricles had broken. General Hayes pressed the call button. The response was immediate. A night nurse appeared in the doorway, took one look at Emma's monitor displaying a heart rate of 146 and blood pressure of 76/40 seconds, and disappeared to make the pages herself. Brooke pulled the pericardiocentesis kit from the crash cart, muscle memory moving her hands through the motions with the precision that came from having performed the procedure twice before, both times in a Baghdad field hospital under mortar fire, both times saving lives that would have been lost if she'd waited for someone else's authorization. She paged Whitfield stat. Nothing. She paged again, adding the critical patient designation. The response came through the phone system, and his voice carried the irritation of a man interrupted from sleep, a man who saw this call as an imposition rather than what it actually was, a child's last chance. What is it, Nurse Sullivan? Patient Hayes, room 408. Decompensating. Presumed pericardial effusion with tamponade. Requesting physician evaluation stat. The pause lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then, it's 2 in the morning. Unless she's actively coding, that can wait until morning rounds. Brooke's hands, which had been moving through the ritual of preparation, stopped for a single heartbeat. When her voice came again, every word was precisely measured. The patient's blood pressure is 76/42 and falling. Her heart rate is 146. Her respiratory rate is 34. She is actively decompensating. Did I ask for a report, Nurse Sullivan? I said wait until rounds. Do not, and here he dragged out the words with deliberate slowness, touch that patient. That's an order. The line went dead. The call button light outside Emma's room blinked off. The monitors continued their rhythm, now accelerating toward a trajectory that ended in cardiac arrest. General Hayes moved toward the door. I'm going to find him. I'm going to. He won't come, Brooke said quietly. The words were true and they were devastating, and they hung in the air between them like a condemned prisoner between two walls. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Emma's oxygen saturation had dropped to 88%, and the child's eyes, which had been open and unfocused, were beginning to lose coherence, and somewhere in the system that Dr. Whitfield had built for himself, a system where he was always right, where his diagnosis was always correct, where nurses who questioned his judgment were removed from cases, somewhere in that perfectly constructed edifice of authority, he had created the precise conditions for a child to die of a condition that was entirely reversible if treated in the next 18 minutes. General Hayes stood in the middle of the room, a man accustomed to giving orders, accustomed to having his commands obeyed instantly, accustomed to control, and for the first time since the phone call 3 days earlier telling him his daughter had been admitted to the ICU, he had no control at all. What do we do? He asked. Brooke was already moving. We handle it. Room 408's monitor flickered in the hallway darkness. Brooke stood outside the window, watching. Blood pressure 72/42. Heart rate 118 and climbing. The numbers told a story 12 doctors had missed completely. She'd seen this before. Not in a textbook. In reality. In a Baghdad field hospital where the walls shook from mortar fire and a corporal's heart was being crushed from the inside by fluid accumulating in the pericardial sac. The presentation was identical. The muffled heart sounds. The distended jugular veins. The compensatory tachycardia as the body tried desperately to push blood through a shrinking chamber. Cardiac tamponade. The girl was suffocating from her own pericardial fluid, and nobody on this shift had connected the dots. Blood pressure dropped again. 68/40 now. Emma's small chest heaved against the sheets, her color fading from pink to pale gray. The child's lips were losing their definition, becoming the same shade as her skin. Brooke could see the effort it took to breathe, each inhalation a conscious decision, each exhalation a small surrender. Through the window, she watched General Hayes press the call button. His jaw was locked. His hands made fists. A Marine officer trained to act, forced to wait while his daughter deteriorated in front of him. Brooke's phone vibrated. A text from Dr. Whitfield: "If that child codes, it's on your documentation. Stay in your lane." 3 seconds passed. 4. 5. She thought of her own son, Marcus, 16 years old, built like a young diesel engine, currently stationed with the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines out of Camp Lejeune. He was under officers. He was trusting that the people around him would make the hard call when the moment came. He was trusting that experience and training would override protocol when lives were on the line. Brooke had learned that lesson in Fallujah, Jolan District, 2009. Their medic, Petty Officer Santos, had taken shrapnel through the femoral artery. Command said extraction was impossible: 3 blocks of open street, IED-laden intersections, sniper nests on every roof. She'd held his squad together for 40 hours in an abandoned schoolhouse, 2 men performing pressure dressing changes every 4 minutes, Brooke managing the bleeding while rounds punched through the cinder block walls around them. When Santos flatlined at hour 37, she performed open cardiac massage on the concrete floor, her hands working in the rhythm of a song she couldn't get out of her head. Not because protocol said to. Because the moment demanded it. Emma's pressure dropped to 65/38. The monitor's beep accelerated into a frantic rhythm. The sound cut through the hallway like an alarm everyone else was ignoring. Brooke didn't hesitate. She moved. The supply cart with the crash kit was 4 steps away. She grabbed it without running would trigger attention, and pushed it directly into room 408. General Hayes looked up, hope flooding his face. She held up one hand. "General, I need you outside. Right now." It's not a request. He understood. He was military. The voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He stood, squeezed Emma's hand once, and stepped into the hallway without another word. Brooke closed the door and turned to the crash cart. Her hands moved on their own. They hadn't forgotten anything. Not a single motion from field hospitals under mortar fire. Not a single procedure learned in the dark while thunder rolled overhead. She pulled the pericardiocentesis kit, a 14-gauge needle, a small syringe, the sterile field markers. The kit had been sitting in this hospital's crash cart for 3 years, likely never used by the physicians who knew the protocol but had never seen someone actually need it performed. Emma watched her with eyes that were starting to glaze. The girl's breathing had become shallow. The skin around her lips was turning blue. "I'm going to help you breathe better," Brooke said quietly. She wasn't asking permission. She wasn't calling Whitfield again. She was a Master Chief Petty Officer who had held lives together for 40 hours in a war zone, and a 7-year-old child's pericardium was filling with blood while administrators played politics in hallways. She swabbed the subxiphoid area with betadine, a broad circular motion. The iodine smell bloomed sharp and medicinal, familiar from 100 field procedures, 100 moments where antiseptic was all that stood between infection and death. The needle was cold steel in her fingers. She positioned it beneath Emma's xiphoid process at a 45-degree angle, advancing slowly, feeling for the give. The resistance. The moment when the needle would puncture the pericardial sac. She felt it. The needle slipped through. Brooke withdrew the plunger slowly, gently, watching the syringe. Blood appeared immediately, dark, viscous pericardial fluid, the fluid that had been crushing the girl's heart with every beat. First 50 milliliters. The monitor's rhythm shifted slightly. Emma's shoulders relaxed fractionally. 100 milliliters. The color returning to her face. 150 milliliters. A real breath now, not the shallow gasping of a drowning child, but actual air moving into her lungs. At 200 milliliters, Brooke withdrew the needle and set it in the contamination field. She checked the monitor. Blood pressure 95/60. Oxygen saturation rising from 84 to 91. Heart rate settling from the frantic 118 down to 105. Emma's eyes were open. Aware. The blue tint was already fading from her lips. "You're going to be okay," Brooke said. She pulled off the latex gloves with a snap that sounded too loud in the small room. "Your heart can pump now." The door burst open. Dr. Whitfield filled the frame, his face already darkening with anger. His eyes locked on the pericardiocentesis kit spread across the bedside table. The discarded needle in the sharps container. Emma's improved vital signs glowing on the monitor like an accusation. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. General Hayes stood behind Whitfield in the doorway, his expression shifting from relief to something colder. Something that looked at the spread of medical supplies on the table and at the doctor who had ordered a nurse not to intervene, and began calculating. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Whitfield. The worst part was that Brooke was already moving toward him, her body language shifting in that moment from deferential nurse to someone who had just saved a child's life without permission. Her eyes met his, not with apology, not with deference, but with the flat certainty of someone who had already survived worse than his anger. She needed a procedure, Brooke said. Her voice had dropped an octave. The pericardium was compromised. 90 seconds of untreated tamponade and you lose the patient. Whitfield's jaw clenched. You just performed a physician-level intervention without authorization. That's criminal scope violation. I'm calling hospital security right now. But he wasn't moving. He was still looking at the monitor. At Emma's color. At the general standing behind him in a marine dress uniform that suddenly seemed to occupy more space in the room. "Is my daughter stable?" General Hayes asked. The question was directed at Brooke, not at Whitfield. "Yes, sir," Brooke said. Co-issue was fluid compression. That's resolved. She'll need a cardiologist evaluation and imaging to determine the underlying cause of the effusion, but the acute decompensation is controlled. The general's eyes closed for just a moment. Relief. Then something else. Understanding beginning to dawn. He looked at the doctor who had ordered this nurse not to touch his daughter, then back at the nurse who had just performed an emergency procedure with the precision of someone who'd done it 100 times before. General Hayes stepped into the room and positioned himself between Whitfield and Brooke. It was a gesture that looked casual but carried the weight of command authority, of rank, of someone protecting personnel. "I want this nurse's information documented as the physician of record for the pericardiocentesis intervention," the general said quietly. "That procedure saved my daughter's life. If there's going to be a scope of practice review, it will be reviewed against the outcome and the timeline, not against hospital politics." Whitfield's face was going white now. Not from anger anymore. From understanding that something had just shifted. That a Marine general's daughter was alive because of a nurse he'd tried to silence, and that fact was about to become a problem that extended far beyond this hospital room. He turned and left. His footsteps down the hallway sounded different, no longer confident, no longer assured of his authority. Dr. Whitfield arrived at 0247 hours, his footsteps sharp against the tile floor. He stopped in the doorway of room 408. His eyes moved from Emma's monitor to the empty pericardiocentesis kit on the bedside table. From the 4 tower to Brooke's steady hands as she documented the procedure. His face went white, not with relief, but something darker. Fury. Rage compressed into surgical precision. "What did you do?" His voice was quiet. That was worse than yelling. Brooke didn't look up from her charting. Cardiac tamponade. 200 cc of hemorrhagic fluid around the pericardium. The needle was positioned subxiphoid, standard approach. Her pressure stabilized within 90 seconds of drainage. "I didn't ask for a clinical summary. I asked what you did." He stepped into the room. You performed a surgical procedure without physician supervision. Without authorization. Without me. General Hayes, who had been watching from the corner since Brooke's hands moved, spoke quietly. Doctor, my daughter was dying. I watched her oxygen saturation drop to 68. I watched her blood pressure fall. And I watched this nurse save her life with a procedure you refused to evaluate. Whitfield didn't even acknowledge him. His attention stayed on Brooke like a laser sight. You're a registered nurse. You follow protocols. You don't make clinical decisions. You certainly don't perform invasive procedures based on your own assessment. Brooke finally looked at him. Her jaw was set, her eyes the color of storm water. The clinical presentation was unmistakable. Muffled heart sounds. Distended jugular veins. Hypertension despite fluid resuscitation. 12 physicians examined this child. None of them ordered imaging to rule out pericardial effusion. I documented the concern in my charting. You removed me from the case. You exceeded your scope of practice. I saved a 7-year-old's life. The silence that followed was the kind that exists before explosions. Whitfield's hands clenched at his sides. He turned and walked out of the room without another word. His footsteps down the hallway sounded different, no longer confident, no longer assured of his authority. But that wasn't the worst part. What came next was competent. Calculated. Ruthless. By 0600 hours, Whitfield had made 5 phone calls. The hospital CEO at home. Board member Patricia Sterling, who'd approved his last equipment contract without full review. Board member James Conrad, who'd accepted a consulting fee for equipment evaluations. A vice president at an investigative firm he'd used before. And a nursing administrator at Sunset Gardens Assisted Living in Portland, Oregon, the facility listed on Brooke's resume, the facility that didn't actually have a record of employing her. The investigator arrived at 0530 hours. He spent 90 minutes pulling Brooke's file, cross-referencing her credentials, and making calls to the references she'd listed. None of them answered because none of them existed. Her previous employment couldn't be verified. Her timeline had gaps. Her background didn't hold up under scrutiny because it wasn't supposed to. It was a ghost resume for someone who wasn't supposed to exist. Whitfield had built a case. Not a good one, but a believable one. A nurse performing unauthorized surgical procedures. A nurse with falsified employment history. A nurse who'd been lying about her credentials for 3 years. At 06 for 5 hours, Brooke was summoned to the administrative office. She knew before she walked in. The way Cole, the security supervisor, wouldn't meet her eyes. The way the HR director's hands trembled as she read from the investigator's report. The way Whitfield sat at the back of the room with his arms crossed, watching her face for any sign of the fear he'd engineered. Miss Sullivan, we've completed a review of your scope of practice violations and the discrepancies in your employment history, the HR director began. Effective immediately, you are terminated for violation of hospital protocol and falsification of employment records. Brooke didn't argue. Didn't explain. Didn't defend herself. Her badge was deactivated at the desk. Cole escorted her to her locker under the unspoken supervision of a security guard. She removed her scrubs, the wrapped pair of combat boots from the bottom, a photograph of her son in his dress blues. The locker was empty by 0700 hours. She walked through the basement corridor toward the parking garage. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects. The smell of industrial cleaner was thick here, mixed with something metallic, blood or rust, she couldn't tell. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. Her face showed nothing. But inside, something had fractured. The parking garage was cold. Her breath misted. She found her 15-year-old Honda, a 2009 Civic with 187,000 miles and a driver's side window that stuck if it rained, and got in. The leather seat was worn through in 3 places. She inserted the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine turned over. Caught. Died. She tried again. The same result. A weak mechanical groan. Silence. She sat in the darkness with her hands gripping the steering wheel. Her forehead came down against it slowly. For 48 hours she had moved through crisis with the muscle memory of someone who'd held lives together in Baghdad under mortar fire. For 48 hours she'd been Master Chief Petty Officer Sullivan, the operative who didn't exist, the person the Pentagon had erased, the ghost who'd learned to survive by becoming invisible. And now she was invisible again. Unemployed. Exposed. Terminated not for saving a child's life, but for the paperwork lies that had kept her safe. The rain started at 08 for 7 hours. It hammered the windshield like gunfire. The parking garage echoed with the sound of it, water running down the concrete in rivers. She still didn't move. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Messages from staff members who'd worked night shifts with her for 3 years. Messages from families whose children she'd helped save. Messages from Cole, the security supervisor, asking if she was okay. She turned the key one more time. Nothing. The engine was as dead as her identity. As dead as the career she'd rebuilt from ash. She pressed her forehead harder against the steering wheel and finally, in the darkness where no one could see, she closed her eyes. She sat on the curb outside Seattle General's main entrance with a cardboard box balanced on her knees. 3 years of careful anonymity fit inside a cardboard box. Badge. Stethoscope. 2 pairs of compression socks. The scrubs she'd worn during her last shift were at the bottom, still damp with the sweat from the pericardiocentesis that had saved a 7-year-old's life and destroyed her own. The parking lot stretched out before her, shimmering in the Houston heat, indifferent to the fact that Master Chief Petty Officer Sullivan had just been erased for the 2nd time in her career. The first erasure had been ordered by the Pentagon. This one had been executed by Dr. Marcus Whitfield, a man who thought he understood the stakes of playing in deep water but had never actually drowned. Her phone had been dead for 40 minutes when Marcus pulled up in his beat-up Ford, 16 years old and already carrying himself like someone who'd learned discipline from watching his mother refuse to break. He didn't say anything. He just stepped out holding a shadow box, mahogany with glass front, and Brooke felt her jaw tighten in a way she hadn't permitted herself to show in years. Inside the frame, a navy cross. 2 purple hearts beneath it. And beneath those, the citation with a name the government had spent 17 years pretending didn't exist. "Mom, they need to see these," Marcus said. His voice didn't shake. He'd inherited more than her bone structure. The administrative hearing room was on the 4th floor. Brooke knew the route without thinking. She'd walked it 100 times as just a nurse, just someone passing through, just someone whose presence didn't register. The board members sat exactly where they'd arranged themselves that morning, confident in their decision to remove a problem. Dr. Whitfield stood at the head of the table, his face already arranged into the expression of a man vindicated. He didn't notice Marcus walk in. Nobody noticed until the shadow box landed on the mahogany table with a soft, decisive sound, like a gavel coming down in a court where the rules were about to change. Silence. The kind that comes before avalanches. Security Supervisor Cole stepped forward from the corner where he'd been standing, and his entire body straightened in a way that made 3 board members notice for the first time that the man had military bearing underneath his uniform. He was maybe 55, with scars visible on his forearms when his sleeves rolled up, and when he saw the Navy cross reflected in the glass, something flickered behind his eyes like recognition of a language he hadn't heard in decades. "Master Chief Petty Officer Sullivan," he said. Not a question. A confirmation. "I served under SEAL Team Coordination in Kandahar. 2009. The room temperature dropped 5 degrees. General Richard Hayes was already standing. He'd been in the back of the hearing room because his daughter was still his responsibility and he didn't trust bureaucrats with what mattered. The citation was in his hands now, and he read it aloud with the kind of careful precision that comes from command experience, from understanding that words are ammunition when deployed correctly. 40 hours. 8-man unit. Medic down. Brooke Sullivan held that line together without a field hospital, without resupply, without backup. Brooke Sullivan walked every one of those 8 men out of Baghdad alive. Bronze Star first. Then Silver Star. Then 2 Purple Hearts, one from the operation, one from 3 weeks later when she'd gone back into the same AO to retrieve a Marine who'd been left behind. This woman, General Hayes said, and his voice carried the weight of someone who'd commanded thousands, just saved my daughter's life with a procedure I've only seen performed in active combat. I know exactly who this nurse is. And I know exactly what she's capable of. The silence lasted 10 seconds. Then the CEO's phone buzzed. Then another board member's. Then another. Whatever notification they were receiving was moving through the room like a current, and Brooke could see the moment the equation shifted in their collective understanding. Dr. Whitfield's face began to change color, not anger yet, but the preliminary stage, the moment when the brain realizes it's standing on ground that's about to disappear. It turned out the external investigator Whitfield had hired to bury Brooke's credentials had noticed something interesting in his own financial records. A pattern. Every single patient Whitfield had ordered onto the Corometrics 8000 cardiac monitoring system, the one that cost $47,000 per unit and somehow billed out at $141,000 when Whitfield's name appeared on the authorization, received the device regardless of clinical indication. The same supplier. The same kickback structure. And a curious detail, the company's vice president of sales shared Whitfield's last name and lived in a house with a mortgage that required a $200,000 annual income to service. The investigation had taken 2 days. The pattern had taken 48 hours to replicate across 3 years of billing. $1.7 million. Fabricated necessity documentation. Equipment logs altered retroactively. Insurance companies notified. Medicare aware. Federal fraud investigators already on the phone with the hospital's legal department before the board members finished their reading. Dr. Whitfield's credentials were frozen within the hour. His access to the hospital system was revoked. His patients were reassigned. His contracts with the medical device supplier, every single one, were flagged for audit. He lasted until afternoon before breaking. Brooke was collecting her belongings from her locker when he found her in the employee break room, his face a landscape of fury and disbelief, his expensive suit suddenly looking like borrowed clothes on a stranger. "You destroyed me," he said. His voice was loud. The room went still the way rooms do when someone is screaming and everyone else is pretending not to hear. "You had no right. You're just a nurse. Just a nurse who couldn't follow orders, and now you've..." Cole was between them before Whitfield finished his sentence. "Not aggressive. Just present. Just a barrier. Doctor, you're trespassing. Leave now or I'm calling police." Cole's voice sounded like a tank idling in a garage, low, heavy, inevitable. Whitfield left. His Mercedes tires squealed against the parking lot asphalt like something dying. 6 months later, a strip mall in southwest Houston, 94 degrees and climbing, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer like water. Whitfield sat at a folding table beneath a faded yellow umbrella, a banner printed on cheap vinyl hanging behind him, supplemental insurance, low rates. His expensive suit was gone. The Rolex was gone. In its place, a wrinkled button-down and a smile that had learned desperation. 3 people had walked past his table in the last hour without stopping. But Brooke wasn't looking at parking lots anymore. She was standing in Seattle General's parking lot in fresh scrubs, the logo embroidered now with the words Clinical Education Director, Emergency Protocols. Her badge had a different color. Her name was no longer just another night shift nurse. Emma Hayes's combat boot sat on her dashboard, bronzed and mounted on a plaque, to Master Chief Petty Officer Sullivan. For seeing what others could not. Emma was home. Emma was running cross-country at her middle school. Emma's father had personally recommended Marcus for officer candidate school, and Marcus had called last week from deployment with the news that he'd been accepted. The phone call had lasted 14 minutes, and neither of them had cried, but Brooke had stood at her kitchen window for an hour afterward with her hands pressed against the sink, breathing the way they taught you in the field. Inside the hospital, morning rounds were starting. The new chief of pediatric intensive care was a former Army trauma surgeon named Dr. James Wu, who'd worked in a field hospital in Kandahar 12 years ago and understood what it meant when a nurse recognized something before the attending physician did. He asked Brooke to lead the teaching session. The residents gathered in the break room, notebooks open, pens ready, the way medical trainees do when someone is about to say something that will change how they practice. Brooke stood at the front with Emma's case up on the screen. 12 doctors had examined this patient. 12 separate evaluations. 12 sets of hands that missed the slowly building fluid compressing her heart. Muffled heart sounds. Distended jugular veins. The subtle constellation of signs that made no sense to someone who wasn't trained to hear what the patient's body was saying. She walked them through the pericardiocentesis. Needle insertion at the xiphoid process. The hiss of air escaping as pressure released. O2 sat climbing from 68 to 92 to 98 within minutes. Blood pressure stabilizing. The specific moment when a dying child begins breathing again. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together, Brooke said. It was something she'd learned in Baghdad, something one of the 8 men she'd carried out had told her years later when he found out she'd survived too. Cole was waiting by the security desk when she left. He nodded once. Just a brief acknowledgement between two people who understood that some things don't need words. And somewhere across the parking lot, barely visible in the Houston haze above the strip mall, a folding table caught the afternoon sun. A man sat beneath an umbrella, waiting for someone, anyone, to stop. To listen. To give him a chance. But the parking lot was empty, and nobody was stopping, and the shade of that yellow umbrella kept getting smaller as the sun moved higher and the day burned hotter. Brooke didn't look back. She had patients to train. She had the next generation of physicians to teach. She had Emma's boots on her dashboard, and she had her name back, and she had something that took longer to describe than a rank or a medal. She had permission to finally be seen. If this story about heroes wearing scrubs has resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? Let's hear your stories in the comments. We'll see you in the next one.